As we're recording this, there is an ongoing dispute over Venezuela's elections. The Venezuelan opposition is claiming with certainty it was stolen. Maduro, who's claimed victory, has said he wants to put this to Venezuela's Supreme Court to clear up any doubt. Meanwhile, the U.S. is leading the charge in casting doubt on this election. From your vantage point, where do things stand?
That's a pretty good summary on just the surface level, but then on the deeper point, I think that we should note first of all that the Venezuelan opposition have responded to elections that they've lost like this every single election since Chavez died. They've gone into the streets and claimed fraud. If they lost, they have won elections. They won a National Assembly election in 2015. They didn't protest that one, those results, but they also, before the results were even announced, or even before the vote was held, had already said that they weren't going to recognize the results unless they won. That's easy to find in mainstream media. And they usually produce no evidence. They've never produced evidence when they claim fraud. What's different about this time around is that the the National Election Council has not released the polling data from individual polling stations, which they didn't have to do the night of, according to their constitution. They had 3 days to release those numbers. But in the interim, Maria Corina Machado, the figure behind the main opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, not only alleged fraud, but uploaded her own data claiming, because, part of Venezuela's process is that when they're counting these votes, the parties all have people present to monitor the situation and make sure that everything's going smoothly. So all the parties collect their own data. And she released her party's data claiming to demonstrate that the opposition actually won, because she has what they're called like actos, the final tally that comes out of every individual polling station. And so she's uploaded those online, and like clockwork, the Venezuelan opposition, or honestly, the people in the streets in many of these cases now, are not even politically motivated. They're criminal gangs that get paid basically to go and wreak havoc. They set up barricades and try to block streets, try to block just shipping all around the country to strangle the economy, kind of an extension of the sanctions. And they shot guns and weapons at Venezuelan police and National Guard troops. So whenever you have, within days of election, I mean, can you imagine if this happened in the U.S., if MAGA had armed themselves and begun a march toward the White House and fired at U.S. troops or National Guard troops? I mean, that would have told a very different story than January 6th. It would have been what many claim January 6th was actually taking place, and that's what you had within hours in Venezuela. So because the CNE did not come out with its own data, it created this vacuum where Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, some countries, while they offered verbal support, rhetorical support to Maduro, did not come out and immediately recognize the results. And it also led the Carter Center to criticize the vote process, even though, according to Venezuela's sovereign process, they didn't necessarily have to release those numbers right away. It still created all of this sound in the media that, of course, the New York Times and international corporate media picked up on, in order to claim and paint the election as fraudulent. And then you have chaos in the streets, a very fluid situation where it's hard to know at any moment if civil war or something more dire is going to break out. And so Maduro's decision was to actually call on all of the parties, all parties that participated in the vote, to now present their data from the election to the Supreme Court, so that the Supreme Court can run an independent audit of the vote based on all of the collective data. One other point that I'll make is just about the process, the voting process in Venezuela, because it's very different than what we have in the United States. I observed the last National Assembly vote there in 2020. And so I've seen this process firsthand. And the way that it works is, to vote, you have to first present a physical photo ID. Then you do a physical scan of your fingerprint in order to activate your ballot. You vote. And then, first of all, the electronic voting machines, unlike in the US, they're isolated. They're not connected to the internet. So that makes them more secure in the view of many observers. And then on top of that, you automatically get a physical receipt of your ballot, something that we, again, don't have here, just like we don't have the identification process to begin the vote. And then you drop that physical ballot into a box, a secure box on site. That physical tally is automatically audited. 54% of those votes are automatically audited against the electronic tally, in order to assuage fears that there was any tampering with the electronic vote, even though, as I mentioned, it's not connected to the internet. So it's a very secure process. It's the kind of process that is difficult to fudge. So the Supreme Court, with all of the data, should be able to determine what the truth is. And, you know, if the opposition came up with some actos that, if they have it all online right now claiming that they won, it should be easy for the Supreme Court and the National Electoral Council to dispel. But fortunately, in the last day or so, it looks as if the violence in the street has actually calmed down. There were many arrests, and people made confessions, that they were just out, they were paid to go kind of start a riot. And at this point, it doesn't look as if it's escalating, but with the opposition refusing to back down, it's still a kind of wait and see period. That this, again, it happens every time there's an election, and a lot of how it plays out has to do with how Washington and regional players decide to respond. But most of all, it's whether or not the Venezuelan people in public decide to, or in the streets, to defend their government and their right to be sovereign.
You aren't there in Venezuela now, but can you talk about the kind of opposition activity that you observed when you were there last?
Well, when I was there last, the opposition were boycotting the election. So this is an interesting point to consider as well, is that another interviewer was asking me yesterday about the change in support for Maduro between 2018 and this latest vote, because he dropped by, according to the government data, the government numbers, he still did lose considerable support compared to the last election. But that's because for the last several elections, the Venezuelan extreme US-backed opposition faction have actually had the strategy of boycotting the vote. From 2018 on, their strategy was basically to say, we shouldn't participate in this process because then it looks like Maduro is running this one-party state. If he wins 100% of the vote, then we can kind of claim, oh, look, it's just a dictatorship. And even to prove that point, the moderate opposition forces that exist in the country that are sidelined by these crazy US-backed group, when they tried to participate, when the candidate Henri Falcone ran in the last election against Maduro, despite the opposition boycott, the US actually threatened him with sanctions because they wanted so badly to limit the choices for Venezuelans at the ballot box, these Americans that care so much about democracy in Venezuela. And then the last time I was there in 2020, it was local and national legislative elections. It was the same. The U.S.-backed opposition were boycotting. Leopoldo Lopez and that faction, the Maria Corina Machado faction, were boycotting. And the moderate opposition politicians that participated in the vote were actually just like bullied so severely by those other opposition groups, because they said they were like plants of Maduro's Socialist Party. Reuters even published an article smearing these anti-Maduro opposition candidates that I've spoken with, and they can't stand the government. They're basically on the side of the U.S. backed opposition. If like we're really going to divide it between two teams here, and yet Reuters smeared them as being agents of Maduro, which is just very cynical, because these are people that are actually working to have more of a voice in their country. That's not just the ruling party, and yet they're not even allowed to be. They're not even taken seriously by by the media outlets outside of Venezuela. And so there was less participation in the last presidential vote because of that boycott. The people that showed up during this most recent vote in order to vote for Maria Corina Machado just weren't voting in the last 2 rounds. So that's why there's that disparity in the numbers. And basically, since Juan Guaido's little shadow puppet regime was rolled out and the U.S. recognized this corporate shadow government in Venezuela, it took a lot of momentum out of the opposition street game, because after Chavez died, there were first, immediately in 2014, the opposition saw this chance to overthrow Chavismo. Maria Corina Machado was out there once again at that period, riling up protesters, the Guarimba riots that were violent in the street, saying, these were called the La Salida, or exit protests, because they said, we're not going to leave the streets until Maduro exits. Well, they eventually left the streets and Maduro remained in power. And they periodically revolted like that for several years, again in 2015, again in 2016, 17. They stopped because in 2019, when Guaido came into the picture, it was kind of like, well, if we're claiming that this guy is president, we can't really go out into the street and have these big anti-Maduro protests, because then we'd be admitting that our regime change scheme is fake. And so there was, the first time we went to Venezuela, Aaron, you'll remember the big protests or like movement in support of Guaido. They were kind of just billed as rallies, but they weren't like, we need to change the government because, well, we just claimed that we took over the government. And it created this weird dynamic where the opposition was not out in the street, but still not in power. And so this election, because now the whole Guaido puppet theater show has basically ended. Their run on Broadway came to a close, and since that phony scheme, just the mask got ripped off of it, then they had to show that they're not actually in power anymore, that they were trying to run someone else for president, and now they are back into this position of being the victims of the regime, where for a while, for a few years, because of Guaido, that narrative had been kind of put to bed.